the glory and the fall of life. In the sections we've been reading, Sri Aurobindo has shown us the glory of life, the worlds, the many worlds of griefless life. Asvapati can see those worlds, identify with them, see their qualities, but he finds he can't enter there. And that is because of his human nature still ties him to our world. Although I'm reading now at the bottom of page 128, just to recap, although he once had felt the Eternal's clasp, too near to suffering worlds his nature lived, and where he stood were entrances of night. And then Sri Aurobindo tells us that this substance that we are made, this dense mold that we have been made of, can't respond to the atmosphere of those worlds. We can't respond sheer joy to joy, pure light to light, because we have been born in another way. And he starts to tell us about that. He tells us about how when earth was built in the unconscious void, and there was nothing but a material scene, there were young divine beings who were involved in that world, but there they were confined in matter, and they longed and aspired for greater possibilities of expression and experience. They called for something more. So, I'm going to read on from line 487. Or rather, I will start from line 485. They cried, this is these young gods, they cried to life, to invade the senseless mold, and in brute forms awake divinity. A voice was heard on the mute rolling globe. A murmur moaned in the unlistening void. A being seemed to breathe where once was none. Something pent up in dead, insentient depths, denied conscious existence, lost to joy, turned as if one asleep since dateless time, aware of its own buried reality, remembering its forgotten self and right, it yearned to know, to aspire, to enjoy, to live. Life heard the call and left her native light, overflowing from her bright, magnificent plane on the rigid coil and sprawl of mortal space. Here, too, the gracious, great winged angel poured her splendor and her swiftness and her bliss, hoping to fill a fair new world with joy. As comes a goddess to a mortal's breast, and fills his days with her celestial clasp. She stooped to make her home in transient shapes. In matter's womb she cast the immortal's fire. In the unfeeling vast woke thought and hope. Smote with her charm and beauty flesh and nerve, and forced delight on earth's insensible frame. Alive and clad with trees and herbs and flowers, earth's great brown body smiled towards the skies. Azure replied to azure in the sea's laugh. New sentient creatures filled the unseen depths. Life's glory and swiftness ran in the beauty of beasts. Man dared and fought and met with his soul the world. But while the magic breath was on its way, before her gifts could reach our prisoned hearts, a dark, ambiguous presence questioned all. The secret will that robes itself with night and offers to spirit the ordeal of the flesh, imposed a mystic mask of death and pain. Interned now in the slow and suffering years, sojourns the winged and wonderful wayfarer, and can no more recall her happier state, but must obey the inert, inconscious law, insensible foundation of a world in which blind limits are on beauty laid, and sorrow and joy as struggling comrades live. And dim and dreadful muteness fell on her. Abolished was her subtle, mighty spirit, and slain her boon of child-god happiness, and all her glory into littleness turned, and all her sweetness into a maimed desire. To feed death with her works is here life's doom. So veiled was her immortality that she seemed inflicting consciousness on unconscious things, an episode in an eternal death, a myth of being that must forever cease. Such was the evil mystery of her change. So we can go back to line 485. 487. Martin, you would read.
The poised inconscience shaken with his touch, the intuitive silence trembling with a name. They cried to life, to invade the senseless mold, and in rude forms awake divinity.
So this is the result of that aspiration and that call. Something begins to change. This poised inconscience, this balance of matter is shaken, something touches it, there's some movement. There's that silence, but that silence is no longer completely blind and unconscious. It's intuitive. There's an intuition that something is happening. That silence is trembling with a name. It's just getting ready to speak that name. Those young gods imprisoned or involved in matter, they are crying out to the principle, the goddess of life, to invade, to come into the senseless mold. This word mold has a double meaning, and always when I read it in Savitri, I can't help thinking of both of them. The commonest meaning is a shape, a form, into which we pour something liquid. The craftsmen in Swami Malai, they melt the bronze and pour it into a mold, no? Or if we make candles, we pour the wax into a mold. In the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo has said that matter is a mold for spirit. Spirit pours itself into the forms of matter to inhabit them. But mold is also the name that we give to organic soil, to soil that is full of living stuff. So that's somehow what happens. The life force pours itself into this earth, this senseless, there's no sense perceptions or anything like that, but into that senseless substance the gods are calling life to come into it, to awake divinity in brute forms. Brute here means forms that have no sensitivity, nothing fine about them. Dana, would you read?
A voice was heard on the new flowing road. The murmur moved in the unlistened void. A being seemed to breathe where once was none. Something pent up in dead, insentient depths, denied conscious existence, lost to joy, turned as if one asleep since dateless time.
So something is changing. It's not only sea and sky and stone. There's a voice, a murmur. There seems to be a living, breathing being where once there was none. And then he says that something is pent up. It means imprisoned, pent up in a small space, confined, limited. Something pent up in dead, insentient depths in the depths of matter, where there's no senses, no hardly room to breathe, that something is not allowed yet to have any conscious existence, or can't have any joy, but something moves there, turned, as if one asleep since dateless time. It reminds us a bit of the second page of the poem, where Sri Aurobindo speaks of how in that silence at the beginning of things, something in the inscrutable darkness stirred, a nameless movement, an unthought idea, insistent, dissatisfied, without an aim, something that wished but knew not how to be, teased the inconscient to wake ignorance. And he speaks of a little movement like that, which gives room for something to wake up in the darkness, to raise its head and look for absent light. So in commenting on this passage on page 1 and 2, Mother has said this is like the very beginning, the first movement of aspiration. And over the next pages we see how that little movement wakes up something, and even finally the dawn goddess comes and wakes everything up. But first there's this tiny little movement. So it's something like that. Something similar here.
Is it referring to a life form, or when it says a being seemed to breathe where once was none? So this being is the first form of life?
I think this is not even yet a life form. This is a form of consciousness. Usually when Sri Aurobindo uses this word being, we can think of the being, we can think of Purusha. So within all this matter, there is a being. And here it seems to wake up, turns as if one asleep since dateless time. Bhavana.
Aware of its own buried reality, remembering its forgotten self and right, it yearned to know, to aspire, to enjoy, to live.
This is that imprisoned consciousness in matter, moving, aspiring. This comes first, before life actually descends. Kamala. Top of page 130.
Life birth, the thought, and left, and made to light. Overflowing from her bright, magnificent frame, on the rigid fire and sprawl of mortal space. Here, to the gracious, brave, winged angel poured her splendor and the swiftness and her bliss, hoping to fill a fair new world with joy.
So it seems to be a law of this universe, that if there's some aspiration, some call, there will be a response. So this power of life that we've been reading about, so creative and dynamic and beautiful and full of energy, she hears this call And so she leaves her own world, her own native light. She overflows from her own bright, magnificent plane. She pours herself down onto this material world, on the rigid coil and sprawl of mortal space, of material space, which is subject to death. Sarojini.
As owns a goddesses to a mortal's breast and fills his days with her celestial clasp. She stooped to make her home in transcendent shapes. In matter's home she cursed the immortal's fire. In the unfeeling hast with thought and hope, smote with her charm and beauty
Flesh
and never love, and forced delight on earth's insensible forms.
Frame. So, first Sri Aurobindo describes an experience, which it must be a spiritual experience, when a goddess, a divine power, comes and enters into a human being, as comes a goddess to a mortal's breast, and fills his days with her celestial clasp. In a similar way, the life goddess stooped, she bent down to make her home in transient shapes, in shapes that change, material, physical shapes. She takes all matter as a womb into which she can cast her energy that will give birth to all kinds of new forms. In matter's womb, she cast the fire, the immortal's fire. And in that unfeeling vastness, that huge, vast emptiness of space, she woke up, perhaps only on this little globe, but anyway, in the universe, she woke up the possibility of thought and hope. And she reveals her charm and her beauty to living flesh. Flesh is this substance of ours, this physical substance, and nerve, and forced delight on earth's insensible frame. The pure matter is insensible. It doesn't have senses or consciousness of any kind. But when life manifests in matter, then everything has to wake up. It doesn't all wake up at once. We will see in the next canto what a slow, painful process this waking up is. But just that descent of life into matter, or that beginning of emergence of life in matter, made such a huge difference. And that's what he describes in the next sentence, Suresh.
I live and called with trees and herb and flowers. Earth's great brown body smiled towards the skies. Azure replied to Azure in the sea's flock. New scented creature filled the unseen depths. Light's glory and swiftness reigned in the beauty of beasts. Man dared and thought and made with his soul, the world.
So this is the effect of the descent of life or the emergence of life in matter. It becomes alive. Clad means clothed, clothed with trees and herbs and flowers. The great brown body of earth. She's happy. She smiles through all her flowers and all her beauty towards the skies. And it's as if even the sea wakes up. Azure is a beautiful poetic word meaning blue, especially that special blue of the sky and the sea. Azure replied to azure in the sea's laugh. So the blue sea is laughing back at the blue sky. And on this material earth, new sentient creatures, creatures with feelings. Of course, the very first ones were tiny little single-celled creatures, but they developed. New sentient creatures filled the unseen depths. Perhaps first they were in the depths of the earth and the depths of the sea. But still they emerged, and life's glory and her swiftness, that's one of her characteristics. Life moves so quickly. Her glory and swiftness ran in the beauty of beasts, all the beautiful wild animals, and eventually even human beings, man, and the life force in man can give great courage, dared to take risks, and the possibility of thought is there, and the possibility of the inmost soul, the inmost individual consciousness can encounter the world around it. Man met with his soul the world. None of that would have been possible without the manifestation of life. Slava.
But while the medic breath was on its way, before her gifts could reach our prisoned hearts,
prisoned hearts,
a dark, ambiguous presence questions all.
So this magic breath of life was on its way to human beings. But before it could fully reach us, something happened. A dark, ambiguous presence questioned all. There's Mother has made a vivid sketch of that dark, ambiguous presence. It's not going to allow all this beauty to happen.
This chapter was described, the design something?
Yes, I've put the books open there. It's not open at this page, it's open at the one showing the gracious great winged angel coming down, but the next one is the dark ambiguous presence. So you can have a look as you go out.
Thank you.
The poet says that there's a secret will that dresses itself, robes itself in night, and he puts night with a capital N. So it doesn't just mean that period when the sun is not with us. It means a more essential darkness, a more absolute darkness, the darkness of unconsciousness, which can lead also to the darkness of falsehood. There's a secret will in things which covers itself up with that darkness, with a purpose. That secret will offers something to spirit, a possibility, the ordeal of the flesh, the test, the challenge, we can say, an ordeal of living in a transient material body such as we have. That secret will imposes on this new development a mystic mask of death and pain, on life itself, in fact. It forces life to put on this mask. So again, there's a that echoes a passage near the very beginning of the poem, where Sri Aurobindo tells us about how Savitri herself, she's come to earth like the life goddess with a mission, and something imposes on her this terrible trial she has to face. All the opposition of life as it is, matter as it is. And Sri Aurobindo spoke of this as one who does this dark, ambiguous presence, this secret will. Who is that? No? So Sri Aurobindo said, I've deliberately not put any name. But if you like, he says, you can call him the Lord of Evolution. It's that opposition and resistance which forces us to grow. Because the only solution, the only way out, Medananda used to say, is up. We can't go back to some paradise. Often we think, oh, if we could only go back. Somehow we carry a memory of some earthly paradise when everything was much more in harmony before this dark, ambiguous presence had come. In the Bible, there's the story of the serpent who comes and tempts Eve and Adam. But in the spiritual way of looking at things, that serpent too, it's a force of energy, of evolving energy, of progress. So we may look around at our world and think that, oh, progress makes such a mess. No? But still, we can't go back. We have to go forward and higher and beyond the mess into the fulfillment. But now, it's like this. Who's next? Nidesh. In turn
now, in the slow and suffering years, sojourns the winged and wonderful wayfarer, and can no more recall a happier state, but must obey the inner inconscience law, insensible foundation of a world, in which blind limits are on beauty laid, and sorrow and joy are struggling comrades.
Thank you. So the winged and wonderful wayfarer, the gracious angel, great wide-winged angel of life, she's interned now, she's imprisoned. She's imprisoned in our time, the slow and suffering years. She is sojourning, she's living with us here in our time. And she can't even remember her happier state, the way that she was on her own, in her own native home of bliss and delight. No? Here on earth, life has to obey the law of the inert, inconscient. Inert, it means unable to move. That's the nature of matter. Matter is inert. It can't move by itself. It has to be moved by something. And it's inconscient. It's not aware. So that's the nature of matter. When life enters into matter, it has to obey the law of matter. In fact, everything here in our world, not only life but also mind, has to obey the law of matter. That's the dominant principle of our world at the moment. And that makes things difficult for us in many ways. So,
these are all superior to matters, no?
sorry?
Mind and other things, they are superior to matter.
They are superior to matter, but still they have to obey the law of the material universe. That's what. That's the where we what we live in. No? Yes. So that restricts our physical movement. It means that we have to die. We can't live forever. And even we are dependent, or our physical mind is dependent on a physical brain. If that doesn't function properly, if there's some damage or anything happens, then we can't even think properly. It's dependent on that. This matter is the insensible foundation of our world. It's the basis of our world. It's insensible. It doesn't have any feeling or sensitivity. And this world we live in, limits are laid on beauty. There can be only so much beauty. Actually, when we look at this time of year, sometimes it's so beautiful and the light is so beautiful. We can delight in it so much, but still it is limited. Sri Aurobindo, one of his disciples, was rhapsodizing about the beauty of nature, and Sri Aurobindo said, please remember that this is nothing to the beauty of the subtle worlds. So, subtle physical matter is more able to respond. Here, gross matter lays blind limits on beauty. And in our world, sorrow and joy are companions, struggling comrades. They fight between each other. They're dependent on each other. So that's what happens to the life force entering into matter. You'll read? Yes.
A dim and dreadful muteness fell on her. Abolished was her subtle mighty spirit, and slain her moon of child-god happiness, and all her glory into rhythm and stir, and all her sweetness into a mind desire, to feed death with her words is here life's bloom.
Let's pause there. Yes. A dim and dreadful muteness. Muteness is when you can't speak. Well, here we can think of it as that she can't express herself in any way. The grip of matter is so limiting. So all this subtle, mighty spirit which we've been reading about in previous weeks is abolished, spoiled. And that gift she brings of child God happiness, we were reading about those nude God children, no? That's slain, it's destroyed. All life's glory, the glory that she has on her own native home, here gets turned into littleness. And all her sweetness gets turned into a maimed desire. Maimed means wounded, damaged. So here, in our world, the world of matter, it is the doom of life, the dreadful fate of life, to feed death with her works. She's still so creative. She makes all these many, many, many forms, but they all eat each other, feed off each other. None of them can live without devouring others. None of us can live without that. This is the process of death, the great hunger that eats everything up. Ganga Lakshmi.
To feed death with the works in her life's doom. So vain was her immortality that she seemed, inflicting consciousness on unconscious things, an episode in an eternal death, a means of being that must forever cease. Such was the heavy mystery of her challenge.
Yes. So, of course, that goddess is immortal, but in the world of matter, her immortality is veiled, covered up. And so it seems as if in our world, life is something temporary and illusory. No? It's as if unconscious things are in some kind of harmony, and along comes life and spoils everything, mixes everything up. No? And it's just an episode. It's just a short interlude in an eternal death. It's death which is the real lasting principle, it seems. So that this idea of living matter, living, thinking, breathing, delightful matter is just a myth of being, and it's only temporary. It's all going to get destroyed quite soon. That's what it seems like. Such was the evil mystery of her change.
The change means all this evolution coming up.
All these bad things that have happened to life. This gracious, great winged angel. Now he will describe her like an orphan, a little lost child, like a child's soul left near the gates of hell, fumbling through fog in search of paradise. And he describes in the next canto, the kingdom of the little life, the first steps, the first evolutionary steps of material, living material forms. It's very, very pathetic, but also very interesting. So he shows us 3 levels of life. The life that's almost entirely imprisoned in matter and only just begin to live, really. But then the animal creation, which includes eventually beings who seem to wear a human form, but who don't have a human consciousness. And then finally, he describes the first beginnings of mind, of mentality, waking up in these animal forms. This is the little life, the kingdoms of the little life.
Shraddhavan, I have one question. 467. A young god yearned for release of soul. Also described, I don't remember, is in agenda or entretien. She met one god sleeping. Is this god? Suddenly,
She says that God is the first avatar. This is the divine being who has descended into matter in order to change this situation. Yes. But it's interesting to think and to know that even before there were any conscious beings, somehow there were these young gods, these divine powers, living in the material forms. And you must have heard me tell the story about Uda. Uda told the mother that he had had a dream or a vision that he was just a pebble on the beach. But Mother and Sri Aurobindo were very near to him. They were also pebbles on the beach. But he could feel their presence. And Mother said, yes, it is true. So these are the young gods in the beginning of creation, the cosmic powers who've descended, and they are expressing the divine somehow in the most material forms, what seem to be the densest, insensible, unconscious forms. The divine presence is there. This is one of my favorite passages somehow because it tells so clearly the process. There has to be a little stir somewhere of aspiration, and then there will come the response. And then the new consciousness pours down, but it immediately gets swallowed up in matter. And then it has to work there in the matter. That's what's described in the next canto, how it works until it can take forms that we would recognize.
A voice was heard on the mute rolling globe. A murmur moaned in the unlistening void. A being seemed to breathe where once was none. Something pent up in dead, insentient depths, denied conscious existence, lost to joy, turned as if one asleep since dateless time, aware of its own buried reality, remembering its forgotten self and right. It yearned to know, to aspire, to enjoy, to live. Life heard the call and left her native light, overflowing from her bright, magnificent plain on the rigid coil and sprawl of mortal space. Here too the gracious great-winged angel poured her splendor and her swiftness and her bliss, hoping to fill a fair new world with joy. As comes a goddess to a mortal's breast, and fills his days with her celestial clasp, she stooped to make her home in transient shapes. In matter's womb she cast the immortal's fire. In the unfeeling vast woke thought and hope, smote with her charm and beauty flesh and nerve, and forced delight on earth's insensible frame. Alive and clad with trees and herbs and flowers, earth's great brown body smiled towards the skies. Azure replied to azure in the sea's laugh. New sentient creatures filled the unseen depths. Life's glory and swiftness ran in the beauty of beasts. Man dared and thought and met with his soul the world. But while the magic breath was on its way, before her gifts could reach our prisoned hearts, a dark, ambiguous presence questioned all. The secret will that robes itself with night and offers to spirit the ordeal of the flesh, imposed a mystic mask of death and pain. Interned now in the slow and suffering years, sojourns the winged and wonderful wayfarer, and can no more recall her happier state, but must obey the inert inconscient's law, insensible foundation of a world in which blind limits are on beauty laid, and sorrow and joy as struggling comrades live. A dim and dreadful muteness fell on her. Abolished was her subtle, mighty spirit, and slain her boon of child-god happiness, and all her glory into littleness turned, and all her sweetness into a maimed desire. To feed death with her works is here life's doom. So veiled was her immortality that she seemed inflicting consciousness on unconscious things, an episode in an eternal death, a myth of being that must forever cease. Such was the evil mystery of her change.